In November 1943, Japanese commanders entrenched in the dense jungles of Bougainville, in the Solomon Islands, watched through military binoculars as American forces landed on Empress Augusta Bay. Among the vehicles rolling off the landing craft were compact, 28,000-pound light tanks that the Japanese immediately recognized as M3 Stuart tanks. Veteran officers from the campaigns in China and Malaya smiled with measured confidence. They believed that the impenetrable jungles of the South Pacific, with tangled vegetation, deep ravines, treacherous swamps, and torrential rains that turned trails into rivers of mud, were absolute natural barriers to mechanized warfare. Japanese doctrine, refined through years of combat in similar terrain, held that tanks were useless in an environment where infantry could move through dense vegetation, while tanks would bog down in the first depression or mire. Their defensive positions, carefully constructed with log bunkers covered by compacted earth, machine gun nests hidden beneath the tree canopy, and sniper positions on elevated ground, seemed impenetrable to clumsy machines of steel that would barely make it off the beaches. What these confident officers did not yet understand was this: those compact Stuarts, armed with a 37mm gun capable of firing high-velocity explosive shells, and 3 Browning .30 caliber machine guns fed by 7,500 rounds, were about to turn jungles once considered natural allies of Japan into a field of mechanized extermination. The Japanese confidence in the tactical supremacy of infantry would soon collapse. This is the story of how American engineers transformed a light tank, considered obsolete for European combat, into a precise and devastating weapon through jungle warfare adaptations. It reveals industrial capacity and tactical flexibility that Japanese commanders completely underestimated. It is a military lesson that cost thousands of Japanese lives and accelerated the collapse of defensive perimeters once deemed impregnable across the entire Pacific theater. Early Japanese intelligence reports on American tanks in 1942 and early 1943 offered a consistent assessment. The M3 Stuart posed a limited threat. Captured divisional documents described the Stuart as a light tank with only 1 inch of armor on the sides and little more than 1 1/2 inches on the front hull. It was vulnerable to Japanese 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns placed in prepared positions. Weighing only 14 tons, about half the weight of the American Sherman medium tank that began to appear in 1943, the Stuart seemed structurally fragile. Japanese commanders recognized that the Stuart's 37mm main gun could, in theory, penetrate the armor of Japanese light tanks, such as the Type 95 Heigo. They considered that comparison irrelevant because Japanese doctrine did not depend on tank versus tank engagements. Japanese island defense strategy relied first on hostile geography. Jungle trees with thick, irregularly spaced trunks, exposed roots that formed natural traps, and soil that alternated between sticky mud after rain and concrete hard ground under equatorial sun, created a 3-dimensional maze where visibility rarely exceeded 50 feet. Japanese engineers studied these conditions meticulously and built fortifications that exploited every natural advantage. Bunkers were placed on gentle elevations with fields of fire that covered the only passable trails, while dense vegetation blocked lateral approaches. Artillery positions were concealed under palm canopies with small firing ports. Zigzag trenches connected fighting positions, allowing Japanese infantry to reposition quickly while staying under cover. To Japanese commanders, these defenses reflected lessons learned in Guadalcanal, where American infantry, supported by a few Stuart tanks, had advanced painfully through jungle and paid heavy casualties. Japanese officers calculated that if Americans insisted on using armor at Bougainville, New Georgia, or other islands in the Solomon Islands archipelago, heavy machines would sink into flooded ground or be funneled into prepared kill zones. There, anti-tank teams armed with 47mm guns, magnetic grenades, and improvised explosives would patiently wait. A Japanese intelligence estimate from September 1943 predicted that each destroyed Stuart would cost the Americans a trained 4-man crew and valuable equipment. While Japanese forces could hold positions indefinitely with minimal supplies, carried along trails known only to the local defenders. Confidence in geography and fixed fortifications, however, obscured a critical development. The Americans were building an entirely new doctrine for employing light armor in the jungle. They were turning the Stuarts' apparent limitations into decisive tactical advantages. When Marines of the 3rd Marine Division landed on Bougainville on November 1st, 1943, they brought not only standard Stuarts, but also modified versions. These were the result of months of experimentation at training grounds in New Zealand and Australia. Marine Corps engineers had identified a fundamental problem. The standard Stuart stood 7 feet 4 inches high, visible above low vegetation, which made it an easy target for Japanese snipers and anti-tank teams. The solution, while simple, was effective. Many units removed the 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun from the turret roof to reduce profile and eliminate the temptation for the tank commander to expose himself outside the turret. Improvised applique armor, made from welded steel plates, was added to the front hull and the turret sides where exposure to enemy fire was greatest. This increased protection against small arms and shrapnel without significantly compromising mobility. The most important change, however, involved armament and ammunition. While the 37mm gun was marginal against German medium tanks in Europe, it was devastating against wood and earth fortifications when loaded with the right ammunition. Each Stuart carried a mix of armor-piercing, high-explosive, and, most crucial for jungle combat, canister rounds. The 37mm canister round was essentially an oversized shotgun shell, packed with dozens of steel balls that spread in a lethal cone upon firing. It turned the tank gun into a devastating anti-personnel weapon at the short ranges typical of jungle fighting. 3 Browning 30 caliber machine guns, 1 coaxial next to the main gun, and 2 in the hull operated by the assistant driver, delivered continuous suppressive fire. With 7,500 rounds stored in boxes inside the tank, crews could maintain sustained fire for minutes without reloading. This created a curtain of bullets that smothered Japanese positions, even when they could not be destroyed immediately. Tactical adaptations were just as revolutionary. Traditional tank doctrine emphasized speed and maneuver in open terrain. The jungle removed those options. Marine armored commanders developed a new approach based on slow, methodical progression. Stuarts advanced in pairs or groups of 3, always with infantry in close proximity to protect them from Japanese anti-tank teams. When resistance appeared, the tanks halted and engaged positions systematically. They used canister to clear exposed infantry and high-explosive shells to demolish bunkers. The infantry then moved forward under cover of tank fire, identified hidden positions, and marked targets for destruction. This synchronized choreography between armor and infantry demanded intensive training and constant communication. It transformed the Stuart from a vulnerable target into a mobile platform for suppressive fire that multiplied the combat power of infantry units. The first large-scale application of these tactics came during the American advance against the Japanese defensive perimeter around the Piva mission on Bougainville from November 1st to November 5th, 1943. Japanese commanders of the 23rd Infantry Regiment anchored a defensive line in dense vegetation between the beach and the mountainous interior, confident the Americans would be channeled into prepared ambushes. Stuarts of the 3rd Tank Battalion of the Marines began their advance on the morning of November 2nd, after an artillery preparation. At first, progress seemed to confirm Japanese expectations. The first Stuart to leave the main trail sank halfway up its tracks in a hidden swamp. Engineers needed 2 hours of winch work to extract it. Japanese observers reported this with satisfaction, confident that the jungle remained a natural ally. But when the main Stuart column advanced slowly along the primary trail with infantry on both sides, the nature of the fight changed. A Japanese Type 92 machine gun, camouflaged at 80 yards from the trail, opened fire to force the Americans back into cover. Instead of falling back, the lead Stuart slewed its turret. The gunner spotted the muzzle flash through the foliage and fired 3 canister rounds in quick succession. Dozens of steel balls shredded the foliage and silenced the machine gun instantly. Before the defenders could reposition, Marine infantry moved in under the suppressive fire from the tank's 30 caliber machine guns and destroyed the position with hand grenades and demolition charges. The entire action took less than 4 minutes. This pattern repeated along the defensive line. A Japanese bunker built from overlapping coconut logs, designed to withstand light artillery fire, took 6 high-explosive 37mm shells at a range of about 40 yards. The tough coconut logs shattered under consecutive impacts, burying the defenders under debris. When Japanese soldiers tried to flee through a communication trench to the rear, the Stuart's machine guns swept the open area and cut down any movement. The Tank Battalion's action report recorded the destruction of 17 fortified bunkers, 23 machine gun positions, and a conservative estimate of 180 Japanese casualties on the first day, while the tank unit suffered only 2 tanks lightly damaged by small arms fire and no crew members killed. For Japanese commanders watching from hill positions, the results were incomprehensible. Defenses intended to delay the Americans for days were collapsing within hours. Lieutenant Colonel Mitsuo Hamanoue, a battalion commander of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, sent an urgent message to Division Command on November 3rd. He described the American tanks as far more effective than prior intelligence suggested and requested reinforcements in anti-tank weapons and heavy artillery. The reply stated that reinforcements were weeks away and ordered him to hold with available resources. Hamanoue and his men would have to face the Stuarts with equipment designed for a different kind of war. The Stuarts' ability to break fortified lines became even clearer during subsequent operations on Bougainville through November and December 1943. On November 8th, American forces faced a particularly strong Japanese position on Piva Ridge, an elevation only 150 feet high, but with commanding fields of fire over the approaches. The Japanese excavated deep positions in the ridge and created a network of bunkers linked by underground tunnels. These tunnels allowed defenders to reposition without exposure. 2 American infantry assaults on November 7th led to heavy casualties without gain. Marine commanders regrouped and planned a coordinated attack for the next morning with direct support from a platoon of Stuarts. At 6 in the morning on November 8th, after a 20-minute artillery preparation, 4 Stuarts began climbing Piva Ridge along a faint zigzag trail. The track slipped in the mud, but the Continental radial engines, rated at 250 horsepower, provided enough torque to keep traction. Marine infantry followed about 20 yards behind, using the tank hulls as mobile shields against Japanese machine gun fire. When the first Stuart reached the crest and entered a small clearing, a Japanese anti-tank team, with a Type 1 47mm gun, lay in wait at only 60 yards. The Japanese gunner fired first. The shot struck the upper front hull, where the Stuart had only about 1 1/2 inches of armor. The round penetrated the armor and ricocheted inside, severely wounding the driver but not reaching the main fighting compartment. The tank commander, Sergeant William Thompson of Company B, 3rd Tank Battalion, reacted at once. Through his periscope, he had already spotted the Japanese muzzle flash and directed the gunner onto the position. The gunner fired an armor-piercing round that hit the Japanese gun's shield, penetrated the metal, and set off the ammunition stored behind it. The secondary explosion destroyed the anti-tank position completely. Thompson ordered the damaged Stuart to reverse, while the other 3 tanks advanced in extended line across the clearing. They alternated canister and high-explosive fire against visible bunkers. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Japanese infantry attempted counterattacks with magnetic charges, but suppressive fire from the tank's .30 caliber guns and the escorting Marine rifles cut them down before they could close. In about 40 minutes of intense fighting, a defensive position that had resisted 2 days of assaults was neutralized. Piva Ridge fell at the cost of 1 damaged Stuart and 12 Marine casualties, while later estimates indicated more than 90 Japanese defenders killed. Thompson received the Silver Star for quick action that saved his crew and enabled the assault's success. More importantly, action reports traveled quickly across American commands in the Pacific, establishing the Stuart as a valuable tool for breaking jungle fortifications. Japanese headquarters circulated their own assessments, but the tone was increasingly concerned. A Japanese intelligence report from mid-November 1943, later captured by American forces, described the Stuart as a formidable opponent in the jungle due to its combination of mobility over rough ground, adequate protection against small arms, and the ability to destroy field fortifications rapidly. The document recommended deeper, concealed anti-tank positions and attrition tactics. It also admitted with resignation that Japanese anti-tank equipment on remote islands was insufficient to contain the growing number of American armored vehicles. The Stuart's effectiveness did not come only from mechanical capabilities. It came from how the Americans adapted doctrine and logistics to maximize those capabilities in a hostile environment. Tank maintenance in tropical jungle conditions presented immense challenges. American military engineers solved them through disciplined routines and innovation. The Stuart's air-cooled Continental radial engines were especially sensitive to clogged air intakes caused by mud, plant debris, and high humidity that accelerated corrosion. Tank battalion maintenance units instituted rigorous procedures. Each Stuart underwent a full daily inspection after operations. Crews cleaned the cooling system thoroughly, checked track tension that loosened in muddy ground, and lubricated all moving parts. Critical spare parts, such as track links, bearings, and air filters, were stocked generously in rear areas. This logistical infrastructure kept operational availability above about 75%, even after weeks of intense operations, which was impressive given the extreme conditions. The Japanese struggled to keep their Type 95 and Type 97 tanks running. Japanese supply lines were under constant pressure from American air and naval attacks, which made the delivery of spare parts erratic. Japanese tanks that broke down were often abandoned and cannibalized for parts to keep other vehicles running. American logistical superiority turned numerical superiority into overwhelming operational dominance. On New Georgia during the July and August 1943 campaign, Marines and Army units employed the Stuart extensively during the advance to capture the Munda Point airfield. The jungle around Munda was especially dense. Large trees created a canopy that blocked sunlight, leaving a relatively open understory crisscrossed by deep ravines and winding streams. Engineers built corduroy roads by laying cut logs side by side over muddy ground to create a firm surface for the Stuarts. The work was laborious, but it enabled armored mobility in areas previously considered impassable. During the final assault on Munda Point on July 25th, the Stuarts provided critical fire support and destroyed Japanese artillery emplacements that blocked infantry advances. The airfield fell the following day, opening the way for American air operations to push deeper into the Solomon Islands. The scale of Stuart employment across the Pacific in 1943 was striking. The Marines operated the 3rd Tank Battalion with 3 companies, each equipped with 15 Stuarts. The Army maintained multiple separate tank battalions that rotated across the islands as needed. American industry ensured a steady flow of replacement vehicles. Between January and December 1943, more than 1,800 new Stuarts rolled out of American factories, with a significant share destined for the Pacific. Japanese commanders, accustomed to an economy that produced only a few hundred tanks over the entire war, could not comprehend this industrial capacity. Captured Japanese planning documents reveal that staff officers expected the Americans to suffer the same logistical limits that plagued Japanese forces, where each lost tank was an irreplaceable asset. Learning that the Americans could replace losses quickly and even increase the number of operational tanks as they advanced was demoralizing. Japanese aerial reconnaissance in December 1943 identified more than 60 Stuarts at American bases on Bougainville and New Georgia. The number kept growing. For Japanese garrisons defending the next islands in the chain, the presence of American tanks became a grim expectation, not a surprise. The psychological impact of the Stuarts on Japanese infantry was as significant as the physical damage. Japanese soldiers were trained to face enemy infantry with fanatical determination. Facing tanks in claustrophobic jungle with no escape routes induced visceral terror. Prisoners of war captured after battles on Bougainville and other islands offered a candid view. Private Takashi Nakamura of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, captured in December 1943, described in interrogation how the sound of tank engines moving through the jungle caused panic even among veterans. He explained that bunkers that felt secure against artillery were systematically destroyed by direct tank fire, at ranges close enough for defenders to see the crew's faces through vision slits. Attempts to counterattack with explosive charges resulted in certain death under machine gun fire. Nakamura witnessed comrades torn apart by canister rounds. He called it a storm of metal that left no survivors in the impact zone. A captured Japanese officer, Lieutenant Yoshiro Takahashi of the 6th Infantry Regiment, provided a more technical analysis. He had previously served in China, where he faced Chinese and Soviet light tanks. He noted that the American Stuarts were employed with superior doctrine. They were always supported by aggressive infantry that protected the tank's flanks and eliminated anti-tank teams before they could engage. The combination of tank fire and coordinated infantry assault created an impossible dilemma for defenders. If they stayed in bunkers, they were destroyed by tank shells. If they abandoned positions, they were cut down by American infantry. Takahashi admitted that the morale of his troops collapsed rapidly after about 3 days of continuous combat against armored supported forces. Soldiers began to desert positions at night to avoid certain annihilation. These accounts matched American commanders' observations. Japanese resistance weakened dramatically in sectors where the Stuarts operated extensively. Areas defended without heavy artillery support or adequate anti-tank positions collapsed in a fraction of the time required when only infantry attacked. Operations settled into a predictable cycle. Reconnaissance identified Japanese positions. Artillery delivered the initial preparation. Stuarts advanced with infantry in close support. Defenses were systematically destroyed. Surviving Japanese pulled back to the next line, where the process repeated. The American rate of advance across Bougainville accelerated after refined tank infantry tactics were introduced. In November and December 1943, Marines and Army units captured ground in weeks that planners had expected to require months. The human cost was asymmetric. American casualties decreased, while Japanese losses climbed. Pacific Theater statistics indicated that armored supported operations produced a casualty ratio of about 1 American for every 8 Japanese, compared to roughly 1 for 3 in infantry-only combat. Japanese commanders recognized the grim reality. American intelligence intercepted messages in December 1943 that revealed frustration and despair. A dispatch from General Haruyoshi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army responsible for the Solomon Islands, described the situation on Bougainville as unsustainable and requested evacuation of remaining forces. Higher headquarters in Rabaul denied the request and ordered defense to the last man. Hyakutake and his subordinates understood it was a death sentence. With supplies dwindling, communications severed, and Americans advancing methodically with armor that Japanese forces could not counter effectively, the outcome was inevitable. As American forces consolidated control over Bougainville by late December 1943 and established air bases that accelerated the next campaign phases, the lessons of Stuart employment in jungle warfare were already being codified in doctrine and taught at training centers. United States Army Field Manual 17-33 on light tank operations was revised in early 1944 to incorporate Pacific tactics. It emphasized tight coordination between armor and infantry, thorough reconnaissance before advances, and the use of the correct ammunition against specific targets. The Marines produced their own lessons learned documents and circulated them through divisions preparing for future operations. These lessons proved valuable as the Pacific Campaign moved through 1944 into the Marianas, Palau, the Philippines, and finally, Okinawa. The Stuart continued to serve through the entire Pacific War. It was gradually complemented, but never completely replaced by the Sherman medium tank. Some commanders preferred the Stuart in restricted terrain, where its smaller size and agility were advantages over the Sherman's superior firepower, but reduced mobility. Total Stuart production during the war exceeded 13,000 units, making it one of America's most produced tanks. Hundreds served in the Pacific, where they shattered the belief that tropical jungles were natural barriers to mechanized warfare. For Japanese forces, the Stuart became a tangible symbol of American industrial superiority. An average Japanese soldier could rationalize defeat by blaming sheer numbers or bad luck. The persistent presence of tanks that Japanese forces could neither destroy effectively nor replace with their own made the industrial gap undeniable. Japanese officers who survived the war and were interviewed by American historians in later decades often pointed to American tanks as examples of overwhelming material advantage. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a Japanese staff officer who served across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, wrote in his memoirs in 1952 that Japan's underestimation of American industrial capacity was a fundamental strategic error that cost the war. Tsuji observed that each Stuart destroyed by Japanese forces, at great effort and sacrifice, was replaced in weeks by 3 new tanks, while a lost Japanese tank was never replaced. That relentless reality, multiplied across thousands of engagements on dozens of islands over 4 years, guaranteed the result. The M3 Stuart light tank, dismissed by Japanese commanders in 1943 as unsuitable for Pacific jungle combat and destined to fail against prepared defenses, proved the opposite. It became an adaptable and devastating weapon that broke encirclements once thought impenetrable. It accelerated the collapse of Japanese resistance. It demonstrated America's ability to innovate tactically while dominating logistically. The lesson echoes across modern military history. Adaptability, industrial superiority, and the willingness to challenge entrenched assumptions define what is possible on the battlefield.